While ultimately judged a failure by most of its former protagonists, the alliance between the fledgling libertarian movement and the New Left during the mid and late 1960s can be understood as motivated by two considerations. On the one hand, by the mid-1960s, American conservatism was almost completely dominated by William Buckley and his National Review. In contrast to the decidedly anti-interventionist, isolationist conservatism of the old right, the new conservatism, espoused by Buckley and the National Review, and represented most visibly by the 1964 Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater, was ardently pro-war, pro-militaristic, and even imperialistic in cases. Based on this, any form of libertarian-conservative alliance had to be judged as simply out of the question. On the other hand, when the New Left began to emerge around 1965, it appeared far more libertarian on crucial issues than the conservatives for two reasons later summarized by Rothbard. 1. The New Left's increasingly thoroughgoing opposition to the Vietnam War, U.S. imperialism and the draft, the major political issues of the period, in contrast to conservative support for those policies. And 2. The forswearing of the old-fashioned statism and social democracy of the old left led the new left to semi-anarchistic positions, to what seemed to be thoroughgoing opposition to the existing welfare-warfare post-New Deal corporate state, and to the state-ridden bureaucratic university system. Writing nearly a decade later, Rothbard acknowledged a twofold strategic error in his erstwhile attempt to forge an alliance between libertarians and the New Left. A. Gravely overestimating their emotional stability and the knowledge of economics of these fledgling libertarians, and as a corollary, B. Gravely underestimating the significance of the fact that these libertarian cadre were weak and isolated, and that there was no libertarian movement to speak of, and therefore that hurling these youngsters into an alliance with a far more numerous and powerful group was bound to lead to a high incidence of defection into real leftism of the left-wing anarchist Maoist syndicalist variety. Murray Rothbard has given the following portrait of the modal libertarian. Modal libertarian is indeed a he. The modal libertarian was in his 20s 20 years ago and is now in his 40s. That is neither banal or as benign as it sounds, because it means that the movement has not really grown in 20 years. The modal libertarian is fairly bright and is fairly well steeped in libertarian theory, but he knows nothing and cares less about history, culture, the context of reality, or world affairs. His only reading of cultural knowledge is science fiction. The modal libertarian does not, unfortunately, hate the state because he sees it as the unique social instrument of organized aggression against person and property. Instead, the modal libertarian is an adolescent rebel against everyone around him. First, against his parents, second, against his family, third, against his neighbors, and finally, against the state itself. He is especially opposed to institutions of social and cultural authority, in particular against the bourgeois from which he stemmed, against bourgeois norms and conventions, and against such institutions of authority as churches. To the modal libertarian, then, the state is not a unique problem. It is only the most visible and odious of many hated bourgeois institutions. Hence the zest with which the modal libertarian sports the button, "Question authority." And hence, too, the fanatical hostility of the modal libertarian toward Christianity. I used to think that this militant atheism was merely a function of the Randianism, out of which most modern libertarians emerged 2 decades ago, but atheism is not the key. For let someone in a libertarian gathering announce that he or she is a witch or a worshipper of crystal power or some other New Age hokum, and that person will be treated with great tolerance and respect. It is only Christians that are subject to abuse, and clearly the reason for the difference in treatment has nothing to do with atheism, but it has everything to do with rejecting and spurning bourgeois American culture, and any kind of kooky cultural cause will be encouraged in order to tweak the noses of the hated bourgeois. In point of fact, the original attraction of the modal libertarian to Randianism was part and parcel of his adolescent rebellion. What better way to rationalize and systematize rejection of one's parents, family, and neighbors than to join a cult which denounces religion and which trumpets the absolute superiority of yourself and your cult leaders, as contrasted to the robotic second-handers who supposedly people the bourgeois world. A cult, furthermore, which calls upon you to spurn your parents, family, and bourgeois associates, and to cultivate the alleged greatness of your own individual ego, suitably guided, of course, by Randian leadership. The modal libertarian, if he has a real-world occupation, such as accountant or lawyer, is generally a lawyer without a practice, an accountant without a job. The modal libertarian's modal occupation is computer programmer. Computers appeal indeed to the modal libertarian's scientific and theoretical bent, but they also appeal to his aggravated nomadism, to his need to not have a regular payroll or regular abode. The modal libertarian has a 1,000-mile stare of the fanatic. He is apt to buttonhole you at the first opportunity and go on at great length about his own particular great discovery, about his mighty manuscript which is crying out for publication, if only it hadn't been suppressed by the powers that be. But above all, the modal libertarian is a moocher, a bunco artist, and is often an outright crook. His basic attitude toward other libertarians is, your house is my house. In short, whether they articulate this philosophy or not, modal libertarians are libertarian communists. Anyone with property is automatically expected to share it with other members of his extended libertarian family. More specifically, left libertarians employ and promote the employment of the federal government and its courts to squash discriminatory and presumably anti-libertarian state and or local laws and regulations. They thus contribute, regardless of their intention, to the anti-libertarian end of strengthening the central state. Correspondingly, left libertarians typically look favorably upon Lincoln and the Union government because the Union victory over the secessionist Confederacy resulted in the abolition of slavery, but they fail to recognize that this way of achieving the libertarian goal of abolishing slavery must lead to a drastic increase in the power of the central federal government, and that the Union victory in the Southern War of Independence indeed marks one of the great leaps forward in the growth of the modern federal Leviathan, and hence represents a profoundly anti-libertarian episode in American history. Further, while left libertarians criticize the current practice of affirmative action as a quota system, they do not reject the so-called civil rights legislation from which the present practice developed as entirely and fundamentally incompatible with the cornerstone of libertarian political philosophy, i.e., private property rights.